Welcome everyone to the first guest lecture of the Summer Intensives 2026. It is my pleasure to welcome Michael Smith, a good friend of mine, and he is a PhD candidate of religious studies at the University of Virginia. He was a former Fulbright Scholar in Nepal. He holds two master's degrees, one in social work and public health from Tulane and another in translation, textual interpretation, and philology from RYI. In addition, Mike directed SIT for a year, and he has taught in Tibet and translated Tibetan for several years. His current research focuses on 17th and 18th century biographies, song collections, and ritual texts from northwest Nepal, and I take that to mean Dolpo mostly. Not necessarily Dolpo, but northwest Nepal in general. So please join me in welcoming Mike Smith.
Right. So thanks very much, Andy, for that excellent introduction. And also thanks to the whole team at Rangjung Yeshe Institute for having me today. Also, I want to say I really appreciate you all and everybody who's online, because you could be outside drinking tea with your friends or at the Kora or, studying for class or, doing meditation or whatever it is. But here you are instead have come to listen to someone talk about literature. So thanks, everybody. I titled this At the Border of Song and Story because this talk is really about how, in its more global sense, it's about how biographies and song collections as literary genres in the Tibetan language are kind of a meta genre. So that's the big region that we're going to occupy for the next hour or hour and a half or so. Andy said that we have roughly an hour max. I'll try not to talk for maybe we'll just try to do 45 minutes of talking, and then we'll have some time for question answer and open discussion, because I would really like to hear what you all have to say. So first, since we're here at the institute that joins the monastery and the academy, I have stolen a supplication prayer from the book that I'm working with. Then I changed the last line because it wouldn't make sense. So this is a supplication that I've adapted to our root gurus, lords of supreme accomplishment who've actualized the primordial natural state, your wars, dharmatas, set the fortunes ones in the boomings and guardians leading all beings of every existence whose your mind realize the 10 boomings. Root guru, we vow to you, your lotus feet may they remain steadfast. And in a way, I'm actually giving you guys a model of how a lot of Tibetan, traditional Tibetan literature has worked, and not just Tibetan, but traditional Buddhist literature has worked by stealing parts of phrases and texts from other texts and then not really attributing it all the time. But here I did attribute it, and I just made it my own. Yeah. All right, so actually there's 15 people in the room, so we don't have much time, but maybe just raise your hand. Are you a student? It's okay if you're not. You can stay. Maybe hands, who is an undergraduate? Not that it is that, oh, great. Master students? Yeah, all right. Who's like Buddhist studies, you could say, or like religious studies more generally, or anthropology? Anybody doing ethnography? Anybody like doing history, literature stuff in the humanities? Anybody studying something that's not the humanities? Okay, cool. So this is the outline for a presentation. There's a lot going on in this talk, and I'll try to skip a few parts because we could talk for 2 hours about this easily. So we've done our introduction. Thank you, Andy, again. And here I'm orienting you towards where we are. So we'll talk about the actual location in terms of time and space, as well as I'd like to go through some definitions at the beginning, just to make sure that everyone kind of understands some of the words I'm going to use in the talk, because I don't want, and if you feel like you're missing something, just like raise your hand or just like say it out loud, please. I don't mind if you interrupt. And then we'll talk a little bit about literature, and talk about the particular person who composed the text that I'm basing my talk off today, as well as the other text he wrote. And then we'll have a discussion about methodology or interpretive strategies for understanding spiritual songs and spiritual biographies from the Tibetan language tradition. And I'm using that term purposely, Tibetan language tradition, right? Because a lot of this stuff, it comes from the Nepali Himalayas, and there's a whole sort of political and nationality discussion that I'm not interested in having in this particular talk. We're just talking about Tibetan language literature, yeah? And then finally, we'll just read some poems together and then have a Q&A discussion, which I imagine maybe some of y'all just wanted to hear some poetry reading, which is excellent. Yeah. Okay. So a lot of vocab. So if I'm using the term emic, right? E-M-I-C, that means the insider tradition. That's the way that the contemporary or the, historical users of a tradition, the people who enjoyed the literature or enjoyed, practice, the way they understood what they were doing, the way they would describe it and think about it. Etic, that would be the view of the outsiders, like someone like me, potentially the view of the researcher. Hermeneutics basically is the theories and the methodologies for interpretation of a text, right? So how is it the strategy and the way that you're going to think about actually going through interpreting it and doing the interpretation, which usually we call exegesis, right? That's just kind of explaining the text, yeah? Methodology is a term that I think we could spend all day talking about, because everybody, I think that word means, something a little different to every single person I've ever asked what it means. And they always give me a different definition, and this is mine, so take it or leave it. But I like to think of methodology, methods, and tools as separate things that go together. A tool is something you use, like a dictionary, if you're doing translation, for example, or research. And then a method would be, how is it that you're using that dictionary, right? And then, or a workflow, maybe we can think of more better as humanities people. We're oftentimes, thinking about what steps of our research process, but more, if you will, meta than that is the methodologies. How do you actually think about an interpretive strategy or a framework of approaching or understanding any kind of question, right? And this is all coming from the research question, right? So you have a research question, I want to know about XYZ. Some methodologies, some methods are better than others, but there are methodologies, that process that you go through continuously of thinking about those methods, about what's going to be strategically appropriate for your question. Some questions, certain methods are good for them and certain methods are not, yeah? So that's just my, so I want everybody to kind of be on my page with that, but we can talk about that later if you want. So this is English, and then in Tibetan and or Sanskrit, actually, because some of these are Sanskrit terms. When I'm talking about spiritual biography, I'm using the word nam-thar, okay? Nam-thar. It's much easier to say than spiritual biography or hagiography, right? So we're just going to say nam-thar. That's like a spiritual biography. There's also autobiography, rang-nam. So a nam-thar written by oneself. Spiritual songs, gur or gorlu. I'll use the term gore. You're going to hear it 100 times in the next hour, okay? So I'm just talking about a song. So it's written, but intended to be sung. Maybe originally sung or written to be sung, maybe spontaneous, maybe composed through a lot of thought. Gore. In Tibetan is ma, mao gashagura gore, yeah? And then song collections, gorbum, literally meaning 100,000 songs. For example, the 100,000 songs of Milarepa, which you may have heard of. It just means Milarepa's collected songs, right? It's 100,000 as in a ton of songs, not exactly 100,000, because there's not 100,000. Mahamudra is here, even though it means a lot of things, it means the meditative system and the new schools, the new transmissions, and then Dzogchen or Ati Yoga, the Great Perfection, the meditative system, and the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, as well as Bön. And then yogi or yogini, I'm talking about someone who does contemplative practice on the regular. And these songs are really written by yogis for yogis, yeah? Okay, so the original reason I started doing this research is because I wanted to better explain and introduce a certain set of texts to people who weren't that familiar with it. So I thought, okay, I should do a little dive into the genre to understand the scope of this kind of literature, and then I didn't realize how deep that rabbit hole really is. And this is just a couple of little baby steps into that rabbit hole. And a lot of this is our thoughts or works in progress. This research is ongoing, and this will probably form the backbone of my dissertation, which one day will be available on the internet for free, if you're interested. And then also to think about how it is methodologically to go about as an outsider studying this kind of literature, and what can I learn from the inside. So some theoretical approaches, or you could say some methodologies, right? So Curtis Schaefer, who's my teacher at UVA, who wrote this book, Himalayan Hermetists, which is about Orgyan Shuki, who was a nun from Dolpo. He uses this triple approach of talking about genre, talking about all the text that the author wrote, right? So if you're saying, oh, author X, like Shantideva, what did he write and what did he didn't write? And we can understand a little bit more about the Bodhicharyavatara. Or if you guys are doing 37 practices in the meditation class, yeah. So the author of the 37 practices, what else did he write? I can understand a lot more about the 37 practices if I have a good understanding of what else he was talking about in his other texts. or just a general understanding. You understand what he is more into and what he's not into, and it can inform your understanding of that book too. And then, of course, understanding the history of the person, knowing about their life, right? When you're picking up a book, if you've got some knowledge about the things that they went through, you're going to probably be able to appreciate much better about what they're talking about in their text. And that goes, in my opinion, just as much for classical Buddhist literature as it does for, a new novel written. Otherwise, we can think about categories, right? So Victoria Sujata in her Tibetan Songs of Liberation, Realization, sorry. She, with Keldin Gyatso's 300 some odd songs, she made a chart, made up some categories and talked about how many songs, how many gore were in each category and so forth. And I thought that was an interesting method, and so I wanted to try it out too. But that's all kind of an outsider method, but we'll see that what are some insider methods? So this question really, I got a lot of inspiration from our own Diane Denise, who's is she here this summer? Maybe. No, so she's a professor at Rangjung Yeshe Institute, and she wrote a really interesting article, 2022, about using Vasubandhu's method for understanding a text, but using it to understand the Dharmata Vibhaga Karaka, which is not written by Vasubandhu, but Vasubandhu talks about how do you go about unpacking a Buddhist text, right? And so borrowing methodologies from traditional Buddhist tradition to study Buddhist texts, right? Which of course there are methodologies from tradition, yeah? I think we have this mistake. Some of us might have a mistake sometimes that the methodologies are things that we as academics do, but no, that's silly, a silly kind of idea. So what are Buddhist sort of frameworks for understanding things? The two truths is a really common one, especially from Madhyamaka, or outer, inner, and secret frameworks, different levels of meaning you can unpack out of a text. Some are hidden, some are less hidden. And those relate, of course, to pramana, right? Something that is the first pramana that's directly perceived is outer. And that is anyway, Mipam Rinpoche, you guys can read about this in the Gateway of Knowledge. It discusses the relationship, but things that you have to use analysis for, the second pramana, that's a hidden meaning, something that you have to have yogic insight. That would be, secret meaning and stuff like that. And then enumerations and etymologies. This is, like, for example, if you read Longchenpa or Jamgon Kongtrul and many others, they love lists. And this really goes back to the Abhidharmic tradition, I think. Or even, Indian philosophical tradition of trying to understand phenomena by categorizing it and naming it, right? As well as the names are important because understanding the etymology or the history of a term also traditionally in Buddhist discourse would give you some understanding of the meaning of the term. Right? Research questions. So they're more specific. So my questions are, well, there's this text that I want to talk about today called The Melodies of Mountain Retreat. And and another text by the same author, his biography. What can we learn about the broader genre of Tibetan song collection and literature? And why would I choose this text is because this text is untranslated and also has not been discussed in Tibetan literature because of its obscurity. That's an interesting question too when you do research. Do you research something that is well known, or do you research the obscure? And then if you're researching the obscure, at what level can you extrapolate from something that's obscure and very specific or particular, extrapolate it to the general or to the whole, right? So in our social scientific tradition, and you would say, okay, well, there's 1,000 people, let's survey them. Well, sorry, there's a population of 100,000 people. Let's survey 1,000 of them, right? And we'll collect the data and we'll do statistical analysis and t-tests and p-tests and so forth, chi-squared. And we'll say, oh, with 96% certainty, I can say that the people of this place like oranges over apples or whatever it is, yeah? But in the humanities, we don't usually have that kind of tricks to get, some sort of feeling of confidence about we're talking about when we talk about something specific, that it is actually applicable to the whole. That's an open question. I'm not answering that question today. Hopefully you guys can help me think about it. I think about it a lot, actually. It's coming, I think, both from a place of humility, and also a place of insecurity as a scholar. And then what can this tell us about? Oh yeah, and then the other question is, so what is one way around, or what is one way through this sort of dilemma, is what does the tradition itself say about it? Does it say anything, and what are they saying about it, right? Which seems kind of straightforward. So where are we? We're in Nepal. It's a beautiful day. So up in northwest Nepal, in the purple part. Dolpa in Nepali, Dolpo, right? So we're up here. Boom. Here's a more close-up map that I know is not very helpful for you right now. I apologize, but at least it's there. And you can just see there's spread out villages through a lot of valleys. And a lot of this landscape, of course, is always changing. But a lot of the villages, of course, 300 years ago when the book was written, are talking about places that are still around, of course. So, for example, one is Dotharup in Nepal. This is a picture I got from the internet. And as you can see, it's a flat valley in the middle of some mountains, and it's got a lot of fields, and it's actually one one of the major population centers, if you can call it that, of Dolpo, which actually has a relatively low population. Yeah, anyway, so this is a place where Orgyan Tenzin, who we're talking about, spent a lot of time, as well as Orgyan Chukyi. Orgyan Tenzin was Orgyan Chukyi's guru, and if you're interested in knowing a lot about Orgyan Chukyi, the book's right here for you. It's really good. So it's a translation of her own biography, as well as Curtis's introduction. So here's another photo from my friend Sarah Newton of some stupas near Dotharup. Okay, and some of you may have heard of Dolpo before because of Kunkyen Dolpo Sangye, Sherab Gyaltsen, the Buddha from Dolpo. Cyrus Stearns wrote a book about him, and he's kind of why most, I think, traditional Tibetans, scholars talk about Dolpo, they think about Sherab Gyaltsen. But this story is not about Sherab Gyaltsen, though. His story is also very interesting. And it's the Orgyan Tenzin. He opens his biography by saying, I'm a person who's of little merit, but I can say one thing about myself, and I'm from the same place Sherab Gyaltsen was from. That's how he opens his book, which is kind of interesting. Okay, I'm not going to go through this. It's not necessary. The first top, though, is just saying there are other people who've done some translations and study of literature from Dolpo, including Curtis, of course. Most maybe, I think, foundationally, David Snellgrove's Four Lamas of Dolpo, which probably many people have read. And, when it came out, it was, I think, really groundbreaking, the early 60s, yeah? And then, but in the bottom here, I've added some Tibetan scholars who haven't talked about Dolpo literature, but are talking about the other topic of the talk, which is about categories of Tibetan literature. So Khenpo Min Lapunsok did us all a very big favor, people like me, by making anthologies of literature from Dolpo, like this one right here. It's all in Tibetan. So he just, spent his free time typing them all out from the old manuscripts, which I'll show you a couple photos of. And you'll probably appreciate when I show you the photos why this is a really huge accomplishment, as well as a great contribution to people like us. And then other people who are working right now from Tsum, which is northeast. There's actually many examples of this along the Himalayas. So this is 2 of, I think, the 8 they've published so far. So they're writing their own histories of Upper Gorkha based on their available sources, which are really the same sources we have, which are the old songs and stories, as well as the oral traditions that they have, and making anthologies of song collections and biographies. Otherwise, you have to either go on the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, and there might be one version of the text that you might want to read and work on, or go to the Nepal National Archives in downtown Kathmandu and scroll through the microfilm and find what you want, and then pay real money to own it. So BDRC has been great, and then these projects like these are excellent for people like us. And the cool thing is, it's the last 10 years or so, a lot of Himalayan, and a lot of them are monks, have been getting much more interested in their own traditional literature, and then producing text like this, right? Anybody have any questions so far? All right, great. And then we also have books. What I'm going to talk about a lot about this one. This is 2 years old. So this is written by the graduate literature professor at Sara College in Dharamsala. And this is about Gore. This is a recent, so Tibetan. I'm just bringing this up partly because sometimes I think in our academic context we forget a little bit that when we talk about Tibetan literature, that Tibetans are still writing about Tibetan literature and reading it and having big discussions about Tibetan literature. And it's as much as we can join that conversation, I think, in terms of listening, that I think it helps us as researchers and scholars. Cool. So here's some just quick examples. I just kind of was starting about that. So Dundrup Gyal is really the first he's recognized as the first Tibetan, both as people say he's the first modern poet. I mean, he's the first Tibetan to write in free verse, for example, like inspired by, I think, non-Tibetan poetry. And he wrote a lot of essays on Tibetan literary genres. Unfortunately, he died when he was 32. but he produced quite a lot before he passed away. And Tibetans recognize him as kind of the person who started sort of Tibetan literary theory discussion, really in the late 70s and in the 70s and 80s. And then he's the professor I mentioned here, who I'm going to cite. So I'm going to cite Dundrup Gyal, and I'm going to cite Rondrol, who is still teaching. And then Khenpo Minla Punsok, I mentioned, he's from Dolpo. He made this anthology, Sum Research Group. And then Khenpo Gyaltsen from our own monastery, he's actually written a Tibetan language history of Nupri, right? So, which is pretty cool. And many, many others. Okay, so we'll do a quick textual interlude. I want to stop for a second. Does anybody have any questions? This is not the text I'm working on, though I wish it was because it's so beautiful. It's Tertin Garwang Dorje, who's the teacher of Orgyan Tenzin, who we're talking about today. This is some of the folios from his revealed treasure, the Self-Luminous Profound Essence Dharma Dhatu, that's up to Chung Rangsel, which Orgyan Tenzin wrote about. But this is a really nice example in terms of handwriting. So let's look at some other examples. Yeah. So Tijirong is in Lower Dolpo, and this manuscript comes from there. This is the song collection. You guys can see it okay? Right, so this is in an Ume script of the Tibetan language, one of the forms of Ume. And then this is another version, different. So it is a different recension. So in terms of a work, that means, this guy's Orgyan Tenzin's short biography, right? And maybe I found so far 5 recensions, meaning there's 5 different handwritten copies of this work, right? Otherwise, there's no edited version, there's no wood block, there's no computerized text, there's no e-text, there's nothing like that. Yeah. And then for the song collection, the Melodies of Mountain Retreat, here's one version in Uchen, right? There's only, hello? Yeah, I think there's only 4 or so, right? When I first started working on this project with only one text, I couldn't read it. I could read a lot of it, but I couldn't make out a lot of the spellings. Whether that's a regional variant of the spelling or whether that's a misspelling is a completely other theoretical conversation that one could have, but it's not the spelling that's in the dictionaries, yeah? And so someone like me, if you can't find it in the dictionary, you get confused. In your intermediate Tibetan class, maybe your teacher has told you, translate what's on the page, not what you hope is on the page. Have you ever heard anything, something like that? Yeah, because sometimes we read something, we're like, oh, I think it means this, but here we're working with literature that hasn't been edited. That's from, you could say, peripheral areas where there's no standardized education. Then sometimes you do have to translate it about what you think it might say, right? Because it doesn't make sense in terms of standard Tibetan. And in the discussion later, if you guys want to talk more about that, I'm happy to talk a lot about that. But let's just talk about a practical example, right? So, right. Oh no, this is not the one. Page 20. Yeah. Okay. Can you guys see this? Right. So sometimes they've added words back in. You see these little dots. That means, oops, I've skipped a word. And then sometimes there'll be abbreviations like this little Z. That's an M, masa, right? So this is lam, lama lam. And then you'll see, for example, it'll say sotar, chugi, dam shi. That's a gao shagyu shi. What does it mean? It means base or foundation, right? But actually, it's talking about the 4 vowels of pratimoksha. Typically you would see a bao shagyu shi, right? So a text like this, just as many times as you see gao shagyu shi, could mean 4 as in base or foundation. And just in these 2 pages, we can find 20 different examples of stuff like that. Yeah. Also, this looks like a little backwards S. That's a kasa, right? So these are ways of saving space on the page. And then there's also what's called gungyik or duyik, which are contractions, in which there's a whole sort of, there's thousands of contractions in the Tibetan language. And they did this as a ink and paper saving trick. Okay, so really quickly, who is Orgyan Tenzin? So he was, from Lower Dolpo, and he developed a couple different retreat centers, and he actually founded a few retreat centers like Dechen Pelri. He started as Sakya. Well, when he was 18, he became a Sakya monk. He went to Tibet on pilgrimage from Dolpo, and he went and visited Tanaktuten Namgyal Monastery, which at the time actually had a Dolpo college, a Dolpo Tatsang, because so many monks, so many young men were coming from Dolpo to that particular place, right? Not the closest place necessarily geographically, but because of its association with the Sakya school, which had this strong association with Upper Mustang, right, which Upper Mustang is mostly Sakya tradition, and Dolpo is right next to Upper Mustang, so people would go from Dolpo, I guess this way, sorry, to Upper Mustang, and then maybe study in Upper Mustang, and then they would go up and join the monastery, right? So that's kind of a traditional thing. But then he had this prophecy from Yeshe Sogyal and Guru Rinpoche that he should, go meet a Terten. And then he, traveled through Tibet to find the Terten Garwang Dorje, who he spent time with. And then, but he also studied in his home area with Kamsang or Kagyu masters. I think this is coming in and out. Actually, I think that there's a battery thing going on with this guy. And Drukpa Kagyu masters. So it just gives you a little sense, maybe cross the inter-traditional, yeah, no problem. So the inter or cross-sectarian nature of the Himalayas, I'll just say. You guys want to talk about that later more, we can talk about that too. And he was sponsored by Vikram Shah, who is, ostensibly a so-called a Hindu monarch of Jumla, who was very powerful at the time. I think some of the local guys, you guys know more about the Nepali history than I do for sure. But in any case, he had Orgyan Tenzin, the Tibetan Buddhist Lama, restore a temple that's kind of at the intersection of Jumla and Humla and Dolpo. And he was the guru of Orgyan Chukyi. And then he was also most likely involved in the editing of her life story. And it's really quite interesting. As a character, he comes off very strangely in her life story. He comes off really harsh. And one can imagine that he was probably sometimes a difficult human to deal with. The fierce guru, he had a lot of fierce guru vibe. And I think he spent a lot of time telling other people how they were making mistakes. So his text that he wrote as a commentary on Terten Garwang Dorje's, I'll just say, this is Sandul Monastery as it looked when Erhard took the photo. And then this is more recently taken from the internet. So this is the monastery he renovated 300 years ago. Since been renovated again. So these are some of the main texts. I already mentioned he wrote a short biography and he wrote a song collection. He also wrote a commentary on a meditation teaching from Terma of Garwang Dorjes, right? And he titled it Chaksok at the beginning, the Dzogchen Mahamudra text, right? And that's an open question about, exactly why, but it just kind of indicates the sort of how the lineages were tied together, especially by this point. All right, this is a big chart. This is just a little bit. So sometimes in humanities, we do get to use quantitative methods, and sometimes they're appropriate. So for example, between the song collection, which has 200 songs, and the biography, which has 41 songs or so, I was curious if any overlapped, and so I counted them, and there were 19 of them that overlapped, and 3 of them are kind of similar but not exactly the same, which itself is actually a very interesting question. And I did try to make categories because I was like, oh, Victoria made some categories, let me make some categories. And then I tried to put them in these little buckets, and that's what led me to the methodological or interpretive dilemma that I'm here to talk to you about mainly today, about halfway point in my talk. So, but as you can see, the majority of them, more than half of them, are either advice to other people or instructions, right? It just goes to show you a lot of the songs are saying as an instruction to a student, yeah? Some of them are specific instructions. Orgyan Pelzong came to me and asked me to say something that would benefit his mind, right? That literally, and then I sang him a song, and this is the song, right? Or they were at a festival celebrating the end of a retreat or finishing a drupchen, like a prayer festival. And then at the end, they all sang shared songs traditionally. And he's saying this is the song he would sing to the general public, which is more like general advice. Yeah. Some of them are songs that are sad songs about a friend of his died, or when his guru died, he wrote a song about it, expressing his sadness. Many of them are celebrations or praises, though. The Yogi Happy Song. And it says actually, Neljorbe Gilu the happy song of the yogi. He introduces it like that. Oh, and he also has songs that he introduces as Gyulu, my sad song. Yeah. Also supplications, of course, like the one that I read at the beginning, is written as a I was actually originally written as a long life prayer, but it is a gur, and it's a supplication to the Lama. Or some of them are ngarangla kata linyan or whatever, and it'd be like, I sang a song to advise myself, which is really cool. And also this is also its own little sub tradition. And then some of them are rangnam or namtar. He has 3 songs that he calls his namtar gur. So that's like straight up if we think of gur as a literary genre of songs and we think of namtar as a literary genre of biographies, then we see that they're actually already getting collapsed sometimes. You can make your biography a song. And likewise, the biographies themselves are made up mostly of songs. Like if you read Milarepa, there's a lot of songs in there. And in some ways, the 100,000 songs of Milarepa, it is also a biography, right? The songs are in chronological order. It's telling the narrative of a bunch of events of his life, yeah? And that's one of the sort of points of, that's in the wrong place. Maybe we can skip that. He wrote some ritual text too, like some cremation texts and stuff. And these are his gurus, but it's too much detail. But Sewang Norbu is notable because of his vast activities across Tibet during his lifetime, including Ladakh. And he was the final guru of Orgyan Tenzin, and the one who recognized Orgyan Tenzin as a incarnation of Yudra Ningbo, which itself is also quite interesting, how that happens, how you can tell somebody else is the incarnation of someone from the past and tie them into the legacy of Guru Rinpoche and the imperial past and everything. So here's another cool painting of Sewang Norbu. This one's from Sopema in India. This one's from Sum. This is from a monastery in Sum. My friend Tenzin Namse took. Okay, I'm looking for this. Okay, great. So where does this come from, right? This is obviously inspired by a math problem that I had to do in high school, but I think it's a tendency of ours, and when I say ours, I'm talking about myself and my friends, to think of things in terms of A or B, right? It is either a song or it is a biography, or this is a Madhyamaka text or this is a Yogacara text, right? Or this is Buddhist and this is Bun, or this is Shaivite Tantra and this is Buddhist Tantra, or Sakya Tantra, or we have a tendency to think in these kind of categories. Otherwise, how do we think about things, right? And I was challenged to think about the song collection and the short biography in those ways because they're so similar in many ways. But some of the differences are, at least talking about Orgyan Tenzin, right? The big question is, can we look at Orgyan Tenzin stuff and maybe have some ideas about the larger genres, right? And it also tracks Milarepa's. Anybody who has read Milarepa's life story or the 100,000 songs or looked at some of it and kind of familiar with what I'm talking about? Okay, great. I'm mentioning it a lot because actually Sangyun Haruka's, this pair of works were really foundational for a lot of Tibetan literature, and nobody didn't read it or had not heard of the songs and stories from traveling bards in Tibet. It was pretty much completely ubiquitous, right? And so it influenced people directly and indirectly. But this pairing of having a song collection, a gorbum, plus a namtar is emulating that pairing from Sangyun Haruka's time, I would suggest. But looking at Milarepa, on one side, biography, we can think, instead of thinking of something as a biography or a song collection, which kind of Sangyun Haruka kind of has us doing that because he's got the pairing, we can think instead of what are the characteristics of a text that makes it more like a biography or not? What are the characteristics of a text that make it more like a song collection? And maybe it's more of a continuum or a spectrum rather than an A or a B. And I would think actually a lot of the problems that we have interpretively in the humanities are actually coming from our own tendency to make a dichotomy and then put things in a A or B box, and then, which is totally fine, and we should do that, but then not taking another step and asking the question of, is this actually really a dichotomy, right? Maybe we can think about this in a different way. And not just that, we can also think about it on an XY axis too, right? So if a Rangnam, and this came also from Joanne, so Joanne's the former academic director of RYI, and she asked me a question, is this book a Namtar or a Rangnam? And I said, I don't know. Well, I'll think about it. But it has characteristics of a namtar, meaning a biography, as well as a rangnam. You can't say definitively that it's one or the other. It switches between first person and third person at times. Also, as is common for namtars, including Organ Chukis, the end, we could maybe call it an epilogue, is written by somebody else, right? Because it's talking about the cremation and the miracles of death and the legacy of the person. You can't write your own, cremation story, right? So it's automatically going to be, but the first part might be autobiographical in the sense that it's put in the words of the master, Ngarangi Lamegi Shelne, etc., right? And then, so oftentimes it's written from the point of view of somebody who's listening to it, like Milarepa story. Rechungpa is narrating, right? So is that a biography or is it a namtar? It's supposed to be having characteristics of an autobiography, but it's what we say is biography. And this just goes to show that our category of biography and autobiography, it's our edict category, is maybe not going to get us all the way there for understanding the characteristics of the namtar and our own nam, or I would suggest, yeah? So that's one of my main points, right? Is what are are we missing something? Are we not able to appreciate some nuance because we're thinking about this in terms of our own categories rather than slowly letting the emic categories emerge, over research and over time and over thought and discussing it with people. So I'll just say, I know Rangdol, I met him in Dharamsala last year, and just talking about this stuff with him really, of course, opens up a lot of ideas. So if we can do this is one idea that if you guys are working, if you're doing your ethnographic research and trying to, interpret something, or you're doing your literary research or historical and trying to interpret something, think about also maybe do XY axis and maybe XYZ axis. So on the vertical axis, some biographies have no songs in them. It's just a prose narrative of, someone's life. So that'd be down here. Some of them, however, are all song. Or you say 98% song, right? And that would be at the top. And then if we were to make a Z axis, that's like, this direction, closer or farther away from me. We could, which I should probably just go ahead and get on Canva and make it, because I can't really draw this stuff so well. It would maybe outer inner secret could be one. Maybe that's another way we can think about these kind of things. Instead of saying this is the outer biography of Jamgon Kongtrul written by, or Khyentse written by Kongtrul, period. Yeah, he was thinking in that way, and so that's like pretty straightforward, but something that isn't necessarily discussed in that way. Can you say, is this outer or inner and secret? I don't know. It's got elements that are outer. It's got some inner. It's got some secret. What does that mean? Maybe it's somewhere in the middle, or maybe parts of it are in different places, And then this is, of course, related to who is the intended audience, and what's the intention of the text, and so forth. Yeah, which I do think is helpful for understanding it when you read it, and helpful for if you translate it, right? Because if you're translating something like this, these are probably all questions that you want to ask yourself and think about. Time. Okay, maybe just 15 more minutes. So I'll go back to not to talk too much. So namtar, it means literally nampartarpa, right? It means total or liberation. Peter Allen Roberts, in his intro to his book on Rechungpa has a really short but good discussion about where this word might come from. It's in the Bodhicharyavatara by Shantideva, everybody's favorite text, referring to a chapter from the Gandhavya Sutra, right, which is part of the Avatamsaka Sutra, which says the liberation of what's the name? Anyway, refers to the liberation of one of the 53 gurus of the monk the person that's the main subject of the Gandhavya Sutra. Anyway, the point is that it may or may not have actually been referring to a biography in that sutra, but later Tibetans read it and understood it to mean a biography, right? And so that might be where this word namtar, why it comes to mean originally. That's the etymology, right? Which can give us some understanding of the meaning, but it comes to mean the story of total liberation. And Dundrup Gyal says, well, that's the liberation of a bodhisattva or a Buddha, not the liberation of these other kinds of liberation, potentially. Can be verse, prose, or mixed. Orgyan Tenzin's short biography is all verse. So that's another question. If you have a text that's verse from the top to the bottom, how do you figure out where a song starts and a song ends? If it's mixed, which is really common, like Shabkar's biography, for example, which is amazing. Yeah. There's always a little prose transition to be like, I was walking down the road and I met somebody and said, hey, you're dressed funny. You're dressed like a Ngakpa and a monk. And then I sang him a song all about it. Or I was, And he explains all the different reasons why he wears his earrings and his long hair and his like whatever monk clothes and stuff. And it's very creative and clever, and also has a lot of meaning. Yeah. Or sorry, we can go on about that. Oh, okay. But if it's all verse, then how do you know where it starts and how do you know where it ends? Sometimes you got to make a call on that, right? Sometimes you can tell because at the beginning it'll say like Om Ahom Bhajaguru Pema Sitting Hung starts with a little mantra, then you know. Sometimes it'll say, and I sang that song to so and so, but not always. So my chart here is flawed from the beginning. I'll tell you, this there's a lot of flaws in here because sometimes I couldn't even figure out. I just had to like guess where's the song start and end because I can't ask Orgyan Tenzin because he is in the Pure Land somewhere and I don't have access. Okay. Otherwise, there's other terms like Tokche, which Dundrup Gyal says originally was probably something different, but has come to basically mean the same thing as Namtar. There's also Damgyu, which just means stories, but that's more like this is all Dundrup Gyal's explanation. And so he engages in the methodological approach of compare and contrast. What's the difference between the characteristics of a Namtar and a Tokche? That's a traditional Tibetan way of understanding what something is by understanding what it is not, right? AKA Apoha theory a little bit is going on there, yeah? And we do that too. So Damgyu is more like fables or legends, could be myths, but it could also be a story about someone. And then Logyu, early Sakya masters use that term for the biographies of their traditional masters, but the Kadampas used the word Namtar, and so did Gampopa. And then therefore maybe that's from where it really took off everywhere. Because Namtar is really just more like, Logyu really just means more like history. On the other hand, songs. So I just put this in here not to get too deep in the weeds, but the word mgur, for example, this is the etymology question, which is traditional Tibetan way of understanding an idea. For example, look at Longchenpa, Longchenpa's writing from the 14th century, who is considered sort of foundational for Nyingma thought. He loves talking about etymologies. He'll take the words and break them apart and say they're related to other words and explain the meanings and stuff like that, yeah? So people are still in the 21st century having arguments about etymologies of Tibetan terms, of course. So gor maybe comes from gul, which is an archaic word for throat. Possible. Dundrup Gyal says it doesn't. Rangjung says it does. He gives his reasons. I'm just adding this here to show you that Tibetan tradition is not monolithic in the way they understand these things. And there are contemporary arguments going on. I mean, argument in the academic sense of the word argument, right? Discussions going on about these kind of things like etymologies or about how you approach a certain thing. And us as mostly English language scholars, I'm making some assumptions about the groom, but someone like me who's mostly an English language scholar, probably going to benefit a lot from looking in the Tibetan text and figuring out what is also like not only what they're talking about, well, why is it important to them? That's another way you can unpack meaning is ask the question of why is this even a discussion for them? Why did they care, right? And maybe should I care? And maybe it's not important, maybe not. Anyway, Rangjung gives 3 different general types of gore, and this is another issue for us, where if I say gore or talking about gorlu, everybody thinks, including myself until I read Rangjung's book actually, talking about the second category, which is the Neljorbe gore, right? The Neljorbe Chugor, the religious songs of the yogis. We think of Milarepa, of course, but Gora referred to before that in the imperial time, ballads of sort of the almost like, it's not the word chronicle because chronicle is more like katang, but ballads, courtly ballads about the the battles and about the old kings in their lives and stuff like that. So even the songs were originally also biographical in nature in some level from the beginning. It's packed in. Yeah. And that's pre-Buddhist, but it existed also through the original Buddhist time and the imperial time, right? So that's before the Dark Ages or the Silu time of the Tibetan, after the old transmission, the Nyingma before the Sarma, yeah? And then the third one that Rangjung talks about is what he calls Tsikyin, right? Did I get it in here? Yeah, Tsikyin Gorlu, which Sik means word, right? And Gyin means adorned. Yeah, and this is probably coming from the Sanskrit term alamkara, which is a big part of like Sanskrit poetics, yeah? And I would guess, and it just means an adorned language, or we would say poetical language, yeah? And then he also admits in his book, though, it's really hard to find, it's sometimes hard to draw a line between what is, in terms of time period, the first one is a very simple time period, that's imperial past. Once the imperial era was over, then those songs weren't written anymore and sung in it, or written anymore at least, or composed, we should say. I think some people didn't write them, they just came up with them. Yeah, it's oral tradition. But temporally, we can't really distinguish between the second and third, the religious songs of yogis and poetical songs, because both are happening at the same time. So what are some of the characteristics? So the Neljorbe Chugor, the religious songs of the yogis, are using imagery from people's everyday language. I mean, everyday experience, life, just like your daily life, right? And also the landscape, Tibetan landscape, not imagined Indic landscape. And usually using terms that are pretty straight, like terminology that's relatively common. Yeah, so it's easy to understand by the common people. This is Rongdol's explanation. Whereas poetical songs are using more like ornamental language, and then also invoking metaphor maybe that comes out of sutras and maybe Indian poetical theory. And so in that way, it intersects with Nyengak, which is Tibetan poetry, right? Which is, of course, you can read Nyengak aloud, but it's like written, whereas Gor is a song. So the idea is that you sing it in public, yeah? And then, of course, the meter helps you memorize. Anyway, we can come back to that if you guys want. And of course, the spiritual songs. So now the second category, the spiritual songs of yogis, definitely influenced from Sanskrit literature, though. That said, definitely influenced from Sanskrit literature like Vajragiti or Doha, right? These are for example, Saraha's treasury of couplets, the Doha Kosha, which the Doha Z in Tibetan, and so forth. But also using the sort of folk, traditional, you could say folk, but you could say traditional meters and rhythms and melodies. So you could say it's not Nyengak in that sense, not poetry in that sense. Yeah, this is a little bit repetitive, so I'll just go on. Okay, so the question I had though is Victoria's chart I really like. My chart, not so much, but it is coming out of the book, and it's got 220 different instances, which is okay, like in terms of a number, right? It's not great. It's probably 10,000, tens of thousands of Gor that have been written. So my sample size is still pretty low. It's only one person's, right? But this question of how do we enumerate or categorize the songs is not a new question. So for example, Khenpo Shinga, who some of y'all may have heard of, he also wrote a commentary on the Bodhicharyavatara, everybody's favorite book. Anyway, he also has his lists. For example, so this is, more than 100 years ago, great Tibetan scholar is also saying, what are the list of different kinds of, yogi songs? Let me make my own list. And this is the list he came up with, right? Which we don't need to go through but this is helpful for someone like us if we want to make smaller, like more subcategories, if I was interested. But you can see that emotion is really a big part of his list. He's talking about happiness and sadness. He's talking about fearlessness, victory, and meditation and stuff like that. Yeah. And then also, he doesn't talk a lot, however, about instructional or advice. So this is my list that I came up with thinking about all these other lists, which I kind of talked about a little bit before when I talked about the chart. And it's just, it's a problem. And what's the problem is that it's just a list. It doesn't really tell us that much. And so I thought, okay, maybe I'll do not just an enumeration, meaning just like a list, but maybe let me do some typologies. I'll try to put them in categories. Okay, so happy songs on one side maybe, and sad songs on the other. But it didn't really work because some of the songs have, I could kind of do that, but that's kind of simple. Or what if we do instructional versus, let's say, advice and instructions, make like subcategories, and then things that are just expressing his experience. It's not really like advice or instruction or something, right? Songs of experience. Well, that's kind of overlapping because songs of experience are also kind of for advice and instruction. So what to do about this problem? Is this even a problem that's worth caring about? I don't know. But I thought about it for a while. And sorry. We'll come back to our thesis. I think thinking about literary genres is a good way, especially if you're going to translate something, to help you kind of have a sense about what's going on and think deeply, and also let yourself be challenged. And then maybe you'll gain some insight. So we're talking about emic versus edict. So let's not think about lists and categories, even though, like I said, from the Abhidharma, lists and categories is totally part of the Buddhist tradition and the Tibetan tradition. And let's maybe not think about A or B, or let's not even think about X, Y, Z. Maybe let's try to think even, what is something more dynamic, what's more showing you different maybe relationships that I can't express with one point Section 1, Section 2, Section 2.1, Section 2.2. Those of you guys who are in the class when I'm talking about, Section 2.2.3, right? Which is a way of memorizing a textual outline and organizing information for sure. And we're trained in it. When we train in the Shedra, like here at our Rangjung Yeshe, we're trained to think that way, actually. To think of categorize and subcategorize and have a beginning, middle, end, and, make it connect, right? But that's not actually how all the world works, I would say. So anyway, what about a wheel? Okay, so maybe a pie chart. It's not really helping that much, actually, but it does show the information in a different way, which can be helpful. So pie charts, I think, are nice. Do I have it? Yeah, okay. But it's still the problem. What is the problem with the pie chart is also the wheel, right? Between the spokes of the wheel, it's like a space, and then there's what's the relationship between this space and that space? Yeah. Because is there a relationship between different spaces? Can I show that somehow? The wheel doesn't really show it. The pie chart doesn't really show it so much. But then I was also thinking, of course, about this XY axis and how to deal with it. So this is where I'm at. We're kind of right now, though we're still thinking about it, yeah? So we have dotted lines and the colors don't mean anything, though. I should probably make the colors mean something because that would be nice. But the dotted lines, indicate that this is a fuzzy category, right? We shouldn't think about this in fixed categories. There's relationships and there's overlap, right? But if we go up and down, we have on one side what Curtis calls commemorative or biographical, meaning it's telling about something specific that happened at a time and a place. I met Orgyan Pelzang. He told me this, or my friend died and I felt sad and I sang this song in the year 1707 at this, Dechen Pelri, you know what I mean? Like it's located at a specific time and place. Are those intended to be instructional? Of course they are, right? It's always in the mind of the guru to leave things behind for the, the students to hear and to become inspired by faith and also understand more about the Dharma. But some of them are sad and some are happy, right? And so showing it like this, though, we can see that we can appreciate that some things like celebrations or praises are both happy as well as commemorative, right? Meaning they are talking about some specific thing that happened some time and place, right? And then, of course, there's the issue of generality versus specific, yeah? This is something very super duper specific, but it's also, there's some general meaning in it, yeah? So it's not only specific. So maybe if we somehow could draw a sphere, we could add that specific versus generality part of it to it. Otherwise, there's very general at the top. So this is like specific, and that's more general. You could say for now, general advice to others. I sang this for everybody. Okay, so this is kind of coming to the end of what I wanted to talk about. I'm not going to read this out at you guys, but we can think of other ways of using different kinds of images. I would just, encourage you guys to be creative, when you're up late at night and you can't sleep or whatever, draw a pyramid, draw a wheel, or just like do the mind map thing with the pencil on the piece of paper and just kind of like let yourself come up with relationships that you can't really think of when you make categories 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D. Yeah. Because I do think for someone who's maybe new to, or, I think that for me, at least going through this process of thinking through this, it was extremely helpful for me to kind of maybe get a little bit into Orgyan Tenzin's mind about what he was doing when he was creating his song collection, which was something he started in his 20s and finished in his 70s, right? So that was a 50-year project by a really, really amazing writer. So let's finish our talk today with reading some of his, reading, and I would say I acknowledge my limitations. This is like work in progress and has lots of flaws, right? But I think it's helpful for me at least. And trying to use, of course, both types of scholarly discussion. So let's actually I would like to read you guys some stuff here for a couple minutes, if you don't mind. So the first category, general advice to others, right? So usually there's a public event. Like I said, the retreat finishes, they have a party afterwards. Imagine you're in the village scene. Think of the picture of Tarup. They've got, some sort of not stage, but they've got an area set up, right? Where people are singing songs and there's also a lot of dancing. And of course, people are drinking chung, right? So not everybody, right. Okay, so this one is the general advice to others. Let's see, So the idea is that anybody can, I would say the idea is anybody can hear this and be inspired by it and get the meaning, yeah? So once my spiritual friends and those around me said, you live without any care for what happens, but won't you need a little bit of food and some wealth when you're old and infirm? So this is a song he sang when he was in his late 20s, living like a yogi in a cave, right? Emulating Milarepa, basically. I replied, when I contemplate the lives of the victorious fathers of the past, faith blossoms from deep within. For this carefree beggar, a destitute vagabond, there's no other hope than the Lord Guru. So cast off concern for this lifetime. Listen here, brothers and sisters. Gathered clouds high in heaven's expanse and transient weather down below. In the rainbow colors where sun and clouds meet are three examples showing the impermanence of conditioned things. Seeing that if you don't prepare for death with Dharma, isn't that foolish and crazy? One day we will meet with mortal illness. Though we've gathered friends, food, and wealth, we are powerless to stay. Now, while we don't think to get ready to go, the demon lord of death is coming at any time. That's why I practice total renunciation, right? I would say most people can catch the meaning of this, and the language is pretty simple, yeah. And so this is one of the areas he did a pilgrimage in Kailash, and he sang a lot of his songs at this. Actually, Milarepa himself also sang a bunch of songs. So, okay, so that's very general. What do I mean by specific instructions? Yeah. Okay, well, here's an example. So someone asks him for someone who is his student, who he knows or generally has an idea about what they're doing, and they've listened to, the teachings before. It is super excellent to make the request, I need instruction. It starts out by somebody saying, I need instruction, right? And then he's like, this is awesome. This is what you should do, student. Repay the benevolence of your kind parents with the Buddha Dharma. So to return the balance of their kindness, do as follows. It's impossible to imagine all the parents we've had through our past lives. Vast as the sky and amount, all of these fathers and mothers have been so very kind to us, particularly our parents in this life. Repay your parents' kindness with the three kinds of generosity. Repay your parents' kindness with the three kinds of discipline. Repay your parents' kindness with the three kinds of patience. These and diligence, meditation, and wisdom are the 6 paramitas. Skillfully request these teachings from wise gurus. So if you are a regular person who hasn't really studied much, would you know what the 3 kinds of patience are? Right, this would be my question. So this is saying for somebody who's got some already some knowledge that the teacher knows. This song actually goes on quite a long time with a lot of other lists, but that are similar where you would have to look it up, like, oh, well, let me look that up real fast. But someone who's got it all memorized because they've done some study, this would be like, oh yeah, okay, great, right? And this is Nimapuk. This is actually, they rebuilt Nimapuk. It got moved. This is the new Nimapuk. It's not actually the same one he was at, but it's the same institution, just got moved. My friend Sarang Yundit also took that photo. Okay, so what do I mean by a happy song or praises, right? So for example, they would build a stupa or something, some patrons would do something really, really generous, or they did a pilgrimage and they feel great about it, or they go to a really great cave and they're like, this place is amazing. So in a southern valley where multiple languages are spoken, so he's talking about Lower Dolpo, actually. So from a historical point of view, this is also actually relatively interesting, I think. But in a southern valley where multiple languages are spoken, Le Drikung, this means the Drikung monastery in Lower Dolpo, not like Drikung in Tibet. At the center of the land, abundant in virtue, the monastery, like a precious offering mandala, is lovely and auspicious to gaze upon all around. The supports of enlightened body and speech and mind, the sports of enlightened body, speech, and mind are most extraordinary. Various nourishing fruits ripen on the trees. On the earth are 8-spoked wheels as 8-petaled flowers. Though summers are cool, harvest ripens twice over. Winters are warm and the people wear cotton. They lack none of the many kinds of grain. Sustained by a variety of foods, profound and delicious, the ambrosial beer gives no upset, just like water. In this supreme island of liberation of the Jumla King, blessings and spiritual accomplishments abound, protecting the lives of the people. If you fear for your life, come here now. Here are places to be generous with hoarded wealth. If you are a wealthy lama, come here now. It is a site where meditators dwell, accomplishing stability. Here's a charnel ground where disturbing emotions are provoked. If you're training in the conduct of single taste, come here. And so, actually, I think I was reading this with Khenpo Minla. He's been helping me on some difficult passages, and he also laughed out loud at this line when we got to it. So I also thought, yeah, this seems like he's making a bit of a dig, at lamas or people who have a lot of wealth, because he's at least coming from his high horse of simplicity, if you will. So anyway, this is he's tying it, of course, to creating seeing the land as a mandala and celebrating it. Yeah. So this is Dotar up in the 50s when Snowgrove went there. Okay, so sad song though. I bow to the feet of my kind Father Guru, Kema Kehu, people without Dharma. So Kema Kehu is like a kind of just an expression of sadness or lament, right? Oh dear. So much pity for those who have attained a semblance of a human body, yet engage in negative actions. Faithless fools with perverted views foul their support for accomplishing the path of liberation. Lazy ones who cling to themselves, thinking things are real, foul their good circumstances with their lack of motivation. Okay, so actually this song, I cut it short for time. I have them all, of course, working draft translations. This song actually has 10 different things that people foul up, yeah? And so he was working with a lot of lists. He had some songs, that's actually a whole topic of other discussion, where in terms of like literary figures or poetic figures of Tibetan song, so sometimes there's plays on numbers, plays on words, right? Plays on colors, or songs that start with each verse has the next letter, starts with the next letter of the alphabet, and so forth like that. Anyway, so this one's the 10. When I first translated it, can I say the F word? When I first translated it, I say, this is the song of the 10 fuck-ups, but that's, the publisher won't go with that, right? Because that's really how it comes off. It's like, this is how you F up your XYZ because of whatever. Yeah. Because that's kind of the tone, yeah? And maybe in English, that's the best, I think maybe actually the best word for that particular meaning, but I just do these are two of his other teachers. So autobiographical, one of his Namtar songs. So Namaguru, the father Vidyadhara, Orgyan Pelzong, bestowed upon me the stallion of the outer monastic vows of renunciate. So he's playing on the stallion, yeah, which he probably was familiar with the Milarepas. Milarepa has multiple songs where he uses the stallion as a metaphor. And so he just talks about each one of his gurus in turn and talks about them and what kind of stallion they were. So in Orgyan Pelzong, he founded Guru Gusup Tenga, if anybody's familiar with that, and it crosses the river from Jomsum in Lower Dolpo. Gusup Tenga in Lower Mustang. Sorry, thank you. Orgyan Pelzong was the founder in the 17th century. Okay, so the great accomplished father, sovereign of realized ones, Gyalwai Singye bestowed upon me the stallion of pointing out appearances as awareness. The great Nirmanakaya Vidyadhara, Terten Garwang Dorje bestowed upon me the supreme stallion of profound Dharma treasure. And the most kind father, Pelden Dorje, bestowed upon me the supreme stallion of the sublime bath of skillful means. Pelden Dorje was the Drupa Kagyu master he had who taught him Trukor, like sort of practices of the inner winds. The most kind Tupten Wangbo bestowed upon me the supreme stallion of pith oral instruction. The Vidyadhara Kunzang Longyang bestowed upon me the stallion of Dzogchen fruition. The genuine 7 gurus introduced me to outer appearances as mind. They taught that the stallion of empty mind itself is the supreme inexhaustible wealth. These 7 stallions are this beggar's great fathers. So curiously though, he only mentioned 6. And then here's one of the other, this is actually a different photo of the same Zultrapuku cave in Kailash Kora. Okay, so meditation experiences. And this is the one I think a lot of people think of when you think of like songs, gore, like songs of meditation experience, yogi songs, right? I guess one hope from this presentation would be that actually gore as a genre is way beyond just yogi singing a song about their realization. But of course, that is a big part of it too. Then I gave all of the monks and nuns, this is his prose intro. I gave all the monks and nuns instructions in Dzogchen, and everyone stayed performing the yoga of dark retreat. It occurred to this beggar, that's how he refers to himself, which actually is common for this whole category of literature, is that they either refer to themselves as the old dog, the old beggar, or, the vagabond, and stuff like that, right? that previously in Dolpo, this Dzogchen practice had not been taught. So he's saying in his biography, he thinks this is the first time dark retreat was done, or this particular kind of dark retreat. It's not super clear, but it could be the first time Dzogchen dark retreat was done in Dolpo. Reflecting that this Dharma of the luminous Vajra heart had spread here, I sang this song, Om Mani Padme Hum, to the divine white great compassionate one, and to the Father who has the qualities of the white moon rays. This beggar prays that his own virtuous, and in Tibetan it says karbo, right? White karma may be awakened. In this holy place, the soar cave of white cliffs, I was sustaining the pure white experience. So pure here, I'm translating as pure as the word white. Experience of clear empty awareness. A shepherd with a white mind, devoted and faithful, presented me white curd, butter, and whey. These I offered to the immaculate white deities of refuge. Through this gathering of wholesome virtuous merit, I made pristine auspicious aspirations that we may meet with the virtuous Dharma. Look at Deshwar. I'm not sure what that's doing hanging out at the end. Anyway, so you can see every line has using the word white in a different way. And this is kind of his experience in meditation and making an aspiration. And this is the cave, inside the cave, Zujul Puk in Kailash Kora, where he sang that song. No, not this song, different place, but similar. Okay, so advice to yourself. So here he was sitting around at the party after the teachings with his friends drinking chang. Emma, this Gana Chakra feast offering is vast, yet careless. We slipped into lazy, frivolous entertainment. Wherever I look, there's no essence. And now, as my life wanes, the wind carries my wishes to that empty valley of forested solitude. I'm not a senile old fart. I raise high my old man tunes. I have to say, I'm a little bit unclear about that one, but that's what I think kind of. Here's I age, expecting death. How am I carelessly drinking wine with friends? I long to train in transference, preparing for death in that empty valley, the supreme place where water and woods meet. He's talking about his hermitage. Tadru. This old beggar isn't sticking around. I'm off to mountain solitude. I'm off to sustain the essential Dzogchen view and meditation. My followers, may you have a long, fortunate life, free of illness. So this he's singing to others, but sometimes when he's by himself, he writes his songs of advice also to himself. But this one, it's also kind of, giving himself motivation. And finally, just the supplications. Many of these songs, a lot of the songs are just supplications to gurus, yeah? And every song also has a supplication. Sometimes it's just a Om Ahom Bezaguru Pema Siddhihung at the beginning, but oftentimes the first 4 verses, or maybe even the first 8 or 12, will be a supplication, or maybe just 2, or maybe 1. Might be a supplication to a guru, yeah? So Nama Guru, this heartfelt melody of missing my Father Guru, I offer with a faithful mind to those gathered here. Father Guru, sublime without equal, across the dark valleys of the lowlands, you are the great sunshine of ripening and freeing Dharma. Now you've departed for Tibet. Thinking of you, I miss you. Missing you, I pray to you from my heart. When I find myself in the midst of many people, I miss my Father Guru. I cannot bear it. As I watch the summer turn back to winter, I miss my Father Guru. I cannot bear it. When I wander to holy places in mountain solitude, I miss my Father Guru's deeds deep from my heart. Now you've departed for Tibet. Father, thinking of your fetterless conduct, tears burst from my eyes. Your son prays to you. Please grant your blessings. Okay, so that's a good place to end with Lama Shang Rinpoche. I put this on here because Lama Shang Rinpoche kind of did a similar thing to Orgyan Tenzin. I'd like to do actually some oral history project about Lama Shangbo because he went around in across the Himalayas, and he rebuilt a lot of temples and monasteries in the 30s and 40s and 50s actually. So it was an ongoing thing. That's a separate conversation though. Anyway, so that's what I have for you guys today. That was a little bit over my allotted time, sorry. But if anybody has have anything to add, any comments, or any points of discussion, we have a little bit of time. Yeah, Andy? Yeah.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation. It was very interesting. 2 questions. First off, are there any particular melodies, intonations, or do we have any surviving records of these genres of songs typically, or people in the modern day or later on have to make up their own, well, not make up, they have to think up alternative melodies for these songs. Like, is there a particular rhythm structure? Is it freestyle, etc., etc.?
Yeah, that is a excellent question for a future phase of research. So this tradition is very much alive all across, the Himalayas and Tibet. People are still singing these songs from the oral tradition. In Dolpo, I mean, every village has its own tradition that they keep. It's usually sung with a dramian. Oftentimes sung with a dramian. There's some really basic melodies that are probably really, really old. Just like simple melodies that you can match any like 6-verse or 7-verse or 9-verse like phrases to. Which ones would have been sung when is kind of a hard, like impossible question to talk about the past. But I think that is actually something that I'd like to work on in the future with joining with a group of local co-researchers, which would be the way to do that project, right? Because there are some young people, say like in the 20s and 30s, and who are interested in this kind of question. So people are recording the we would call folk songs. I mean, you could call this folk songs, I guess, right? And so then the question would then be to transliterate those and then see how much they match or they don't match with some of these songs. Now, some of for example, the verses of a lot of these songs are extremely repetitive from song to song. You get the same phrases kind of over and over again oftentimes. The same metaphors come up over and over again, right? For example, the phrase something like, samsara, or like cyclic existence, is like, the games of children. Like this one line comes up in multiple of his songs. Yeah. So did he come up with that line? No, probably not. He probably heard it from somebody else in some previous iteration of some songs. It's just kind of almost because it's so evocative in a way. Yeah. But that is a partly answerable question, I would say, is that once you transliterate the songs, yeah, and then see how they match up. And we can just use some really simple digital tools for that, compare, even just with comparing on like in the word, and then get a sense about, you couldn't say for sure, but maybe you find that there's exactly the same thing they're singing in this place. Like in Dotarab, like these songs, some of them are still being sung. Because 300 years in folk oral tradition is really not that long from some perspective, yeah? Because we can hypothesize that like people are still singing the songs they heard from their grandparents or their parents, and that that's how it continues. Yeah, they get taught both by doing and then memorizing too, right? But most people are not doing this off manuscripts. Like I said, there may be only 4 or 5 existent manuscripts of this text, like anywhere, right? One's in one monastery in one village, and others in another monastery in another village, and so forth. So it's not like a lot of people have access to the literature. Yeah. So like I said, Khenpo Minla and other people at Zoom Research Group, they're changing that now. Yeah. But good question. What was your other? Yes, had a second question?
I think it's relevant, but did you memorize or know any songs? Like, are you able to sing any of them? Well, probably not this one, but like when you were trying to do this research or looking at other songs of different storytellers and whatnot. But
no, not right now. Yeah, thanks so. I think I'd be too shy to do that anyway.
I have a question.
Are there any from the internet also?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, cool. Go for it. We hear you.
Okay. How do you think, or do you think Sanskrit has had an effect on like the poetic / musical style in general versus like Latin's influence on poetic style linguistically? Do you think that even matters in what you're doing, or are you
Couldn't
more
quite hear the last
translational?
part. Can you repeat the second part of the question?
As opposed to like Latin's influence on poetics and musical styles in the West, do you think Sanskrit has had an influence on this type of more musical, poetic, stylistic verse?
That's I'm not totally sure, but I would say less rather than more than influence from Sanskrit. But if we rely on Rangdrol's interpretation of the Neljorbe Chugi Gur, we can also see from the text, the imagery is all localized, right? We're sitting here drinking wine. I want to go. My metaphor is going to be a horse, which everybody's familiar with, or my you know, I'm going to use a metaphor for my retreat place as the place where the woods and the water meets, because it's at the edge of the, you know, where the lowlands meet the highlands or something. Yeah. Which local people would, that would immediately evoke something in their mind, right? A Himalayan person. Whereas it might not, that would not, I mean, now I'm talking about geography, not language as much, but it might not evoke the same kind of thing in a non-localized person. That's one. But, and so the Nyengak, right? That's Tibetan sort of formal poetry, if you will. Some people use the word classical, but and it's kind of hard to use our categories for their stuff. That is explicitly based on Kavya literature from the Sanskrit tradition in India. You know, Dundin's Kavidarsa translated into Tibetan. I mean, Sakya Pandita commented on it, and yeah, right. So, and after him, and he's the Sakya influence is in the Himalayas too, from Upper Mustang and Dolpo. So it's not that we're not aware of that potentially, but it wasn't the kind of literature that they were really mostly composing. Now, does that mean somebody wasn't in a monastery, like in Sakya monastery at any given time, writing poetry that's using the sort of, you know, the Alamkara theory from Sanskrit poetry? Probably, of course, people were doing that, yeah. But then that kind of stuff is not I would just, this is me speculating now. For somebody like Orgyan Tenzin, who's emulating Milarepa's sort of style, then it wouldn't be the Kavya poetics that he would be really trying to base his work on, but it might be more like the direct style of the Doha, right? Like I mentioned from Saraha's Doha Kosha, the treasury of couplets. Doha means couplet, right? So Dohas are, sometimes we say the Dohas are like, you know, sort of tantric songs, right? But that's a Vajragita, you could say, is that, but I mean, traditionally, like Saraha's stuff, which is Doha, is always a couplet. That's what it means. Do means two, yeah. And then a lot of them, of course, like are not just Saraha. A lot of the masters who were, you know, idealized later as the Mahasiddhas, like the 84 Mahasiddhas. There's others like Krishnapada, for example, also known as Kanhapada. He wrote in Bengali, right? He wasn't writing and singing in Sanskrit, yeah. So that would, of course, been influenced by the Sanskritic tradition. Can't say it wouldn't be, but that's a vernacular style of song, which I think that we're talking here about more vernacular style of song with Gorlu. So I would say a short answer is maybe less than rather than more, but I don't really know much more than that. I would feel like I'm going too far out on a limb to talk more about that. Thanks for your question, though. Like Sakya Pandita talked about 3 different categories of literature from the Sanskrit tradition, right? There's prose, poetry, and then there's another category that's kind of like, it's metered prose that goes on very long, which I can't remember the name of right now. Dandaka, I think is what it's called. And this actually sparked a debate in Tibet about what are the categories of possible classical literature, whether Dandaka is its own category or not. But that I don't think that debate really has had much to do with Gore, like with these songs of spiritual realization. Yeah, my guess.
I have 3 questions. Sorry to. The first question is like, first, hello, Meghala. And the first question is, I do Indian classical music, and in the Indian classical music, the ragas depends upon the time frame of the day, and the notes are like notes is according to how the human body functions. So I want to know, in the Tibetan chanting system, do they follow the time frame structure or no?
Not to my knowledge, at least it's not with this kind of what some people call folk song tradition. Some people say that's our term. It doesn't really apply to them, but the raga theory, you know, makes its way into Tibet. It was definitely translated and people commented on it, you know, but that's like a very almost elite kind of textual discussion in Tibet, right? Rather than writing sort of publicly appealing like folk songs, I guess. So I don't know any more than that. Though some of the classical literature about raga theory definitely was translated in Tibetan, people were reading it and talking about it, but more related to this category of they call a nyingak, right? Nyingak is really what we call like that's the translation for kavya.
Is it a Nyingma and Toshe?
Sorry?
Nyingma and Toshe?
Say again?
There's a classical system in Tibetan called Nangma and Toshe.
Isn't Nangma that? I don't know. This is song, right?
Basically, it's called Tibetan classical style.
I don't know.
Okay,
Sorry.
no problem. The second question is, how do the Tibetans people see the metaphysical sound?
In general, I don't think I can generalize about that. If you mean, are there influences from like Shaivite Tantra or ideas about sound being permanent or, being primordial? This makes its way, I think, in some of the tantric literature for sure, But then that would be debated. I mean, you have to be like really specific about this, like kind of, if you try to unpack that kind of question, it would be sort of like, you could ask, in Longchenpa's treasury or one of Longchenpa's treasury, how is sound like treated? Because, for example, if you look in the Dzogchen Tantras, which make up the kind of foundation of, like the 17 Dzogchen Tantras, it makes up the foundation of Dzogchen Nyingtik literature in Tibet, of which Longchenpa commented a lot on the 14th century, right? You'll find information, it's all in verse and some is kind of cryptic and hard to understand, about the nature of the elements and about the, sound and light and so forth. And it has a really important role both in the contemplative practice side and also the sort of theoretical side. Whether that's how much that's influenced by, Indian tradition, or how much of that is what we might say indigenous Tibetan, or have other influences from like Bun tradition in West Tibet, Shangshung, or even farther afield from Manichaeism in Iran, or et cetera, et cetera. These are like impossible historical questions at most, that you can't really generalize, because someone might say, we say someone who was not maybe someone who followed Nyingtik literature or like read Longchenpa and agreed with them might say, this is actually, going against Madhyamaka teachings, or you know what I mean? So I don't think I would just encourage you to think about, like, if these kind of questions is ask, who and when and why. Might be someone saying one thing about sound or another thing about sound. In what context, right? Is it a tantric context? Is it a Dzogchen context? Or is it a sutra context? Or is it a philosophical debate context? Because I think you'll find many different answers to that question in the tradition. It's like a vast tradition, right? Yeah. So I don't think you can generalize. I mean, yeah.
Thank you. And the third question is like, is there a relation between the Dramin and Tungna from Nepal?
Between Dramian and
Tungna.
I don't know. I don't know about the musical instrument history.
I think the Dramin is Tibetan guitar.
Sure. I mean, I know what it is, but the relationships are like historically between the instruments, I don't know. Yeah. Sorry. But the Dramian is the instrument that's mostly used to make the basic melody. Dun, 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 it's like it can get very elaborate, but there's a basic melody, right? That makes it easy just to sing. And then the songs have their own melody, and there can be a lot of elaboration, right? While people are singing. So, you can look it up on YouTube. Actually, you'll find plenty of videos if you want to. Actually, I should have showed one. Maybe I do that next presentation. Yeah. People in circle dancing, but every village, every area's got its own kind of style of circle dancing, right? Are people still doing Wednesday circle dancing here in Bodha? Huh? Cool. Right. So that's, contemporary Tibetan circle dancing. It's like very much influenced sort of there's kind of this big sort of global trend of it right now. But if you look up YouTube and look specifically for Dolpo or Upper Mustang, you'll see much different kind of step work. They have their own kind of traditional step work. It's much more muted in Dolpo. There's not a lot of arm movement or leg movement, not a lot of jumping. As you see sometimes, people kind of showing off at the Gorshe, and then and then they'll be singing like songs similar to this, yeah. But these are the religious ones. That's not to say that all the songs are religious. Just Orgyan Tenzin and the other yogis, they were interested. 100% of his songs are religious in nature, But of course, there's many songs that are not, yeah. It's love songs and stuff like that. That didn't really answer your question. Sorry.
No, thank you.
Okay. Cool.
He says, thank you for your lecture. May I ask about the mentioned categories of Gyurlu? aren't they overlapping to some extent? For example, autobiographical with almost all other categories? And does this influence the quantitative outcome of your research?
Definitely. I mean, like I said before, my chart is really suspect. It's a kind of almost a failed. It's almost a failed attempt from the beginning. And when I first started doing it, I didn't think it was a failed attempt, and I don't think it's failed in the sense of it's worthless, but I do think it's failed in the sense of trying to quantify this will actually maybe is not really in the end as important specifically like the specific numbers, because so many of the songs you could argue half of it is one category, half of it's another category, or it fits in multiple categories. And then maybe the categories have to be reworked or reimagined, but I don't think in the end you're gonna, my guess is that in the end there's no perfect way of categorizing it, at least not in lists and numbered and stuff like that. Gore, that's also another thing. So and maybe I need to fix one of my slides, but because some people like colloquially say gore sometimes talking about just these sort of religious songs, and then lu or luche is more general word for song. But then people will also say gore lu, referring to gore, what we might just say gore. But if you look at other scholars, for example, I didn't mention it, but like there's a scholar in Ladakh who talks about this also, same question about Ladakhi songs, and he has his own categorization system of 11 or 13, and one of them is called chulu, right? So Dharma songs, yeah? Is it gore or is it not gore? Well, then there's a discussion of the authorship. Someone like Rangdo would say, well, it depends on who's writing it. Is it somebody who's got some realization or not? Or, right? So, but I think it does influence it. I think there's a lot that could be said about the categories. I think someone like me, my role is probably just to read as much as I can and talk to as many people as I can and take notes and say, well, there's interestingly, this is how some people talk about it. This is how some other people talk about it. And maybe try to draw some conclusions, but I see, I guess, my role more at the moment as like, I mean, I have the luxury of time, I guess, and an interest to, read books like Rongdol's book or Dundrup Gyal's book and make some notes and, try to collate what they have to say about it and the discussions going on and put it in English. And I hope that's helpful for people in the future. And it will, but yes, I mean, other category like goryang is another term people use. Yang means melody, right? So I think in the end, there's a lot of just sort of synonymous terms that float around that actually aren't fixed. I guess now I'm showing myself as not being someone who's abhidharmic in the sense that, I don't think that the words are like strictly in one category. Like, I don't think we can use the terms actually to just like say, oh, this term means this and this term means this, full stop, period. Even though that is something Dundrup Gyal spends a lot of time trying to do in his work. Yeah. I didn't hear all your questions, so I hope that was relevant. But I think it's useful to talk about it, but I just don't think in the end you get to like some ultimate reality. And I mean, I mentioned that, like, for example, one methodology that we can, I think, take helpfully, especially those of us in religious studies, or maybe in the humanities more general, is this between ultimate truth and relative truth. Every word I've said to you, except, maybe some of the stuff that Orgyan Tenzin had to say in Tibetan, if maybe there was some ultimate truth there, but this is all relative truth. This is all using our minds to build categories to attempt to fit reality, what we understand as reality, into boxes, which only is going to go so far because it's not ultimately true, right? So what we want to try to do when we think about what we're working on is, make an attempt not to be false. That's probably our best bet, I would say, is, and that's, if you read, I mean, everybody's not the same. Not everybody talks about this, but like, for example, Mibam Rinpoche, what we study here at Rangjung Yeshe, he would say, he would have his explanation of ultimate truth and relative truth and say, oh yeah, but don't forget that relative truth is not untrue. It's not false, right? You can say, oh, the mountain is yellow because the snow on the mountain is yellow because of your jaundice. That's like the example everybody likes to, or he uses, right? That's false, right? This is, I hope, I mean, I'm hoping that actually all of us as doing research and scholars, we can avoid being false, yeah? But in terms of like describing ultimate truth, I think that's a pretty big ask for any of us, And then again, in Shantideva, what does he say in chapter 9, right? Anything in the domain of intellect is relative truth, full stop. ultimate truth is beyond the domain of intellect. Yeah, so it's unexpressible. You can't put it in signs or words, right? So anyway, you guys can debate about that, but yeah, sorry.
Okay, thank you so much. Don't look scared. No, this is a fantastic conversation. I'm really curious too. You mentioned just very like briefly at the beginning around I think Orgyan Tenzin had a kind of a blending of Dzogchen and Mahamudra songs as well. Can you say a little bit more about that? How did that come through in some of the songs that you had read?
Right, that's a good question, which I'm pretty interested in more generally historically, because you'll see different things in different places. And I'm actually Chukin Rinpoche would be a great person to talk to about this question too. Is at what point from a historian's point of view, like what point did Mahamudra and Dzogchen get put together into what becomes a Chaksok as its own thing, right? I have read that people give the second Karmapa Karmapakshi credit for this in some places, right? But who knows? You'd have to do a lot of reading to kind of figure it out and think about it. But I think or someone like Orgyan Tenzin is saying, and actually to specifically answer that question about his particular text that starts with Chaksok, right? I have to read that text and the text it's commenting on, right? To see what he's talking about when he means Chaksok, right? But more generally, he has these multiple lineages from a lot of different masters. For him, his Mahamudra, training would have come primarily from masters we would say are in Kagyu lineages. But at that time in that place, as we see now, like people hold so many different lineages, right? And people seek, we do now as they did then, they seek transmission from teachers who they feel connected to, who they are charismatic, who they feel are, have the qualities of a guru, such as being learned and compassionate and understanding how to tame their disciples, right, etc. Yeah, and we get attracted to them, and it doesn't matter all the time, like, oh, I'm a Nyingma Pan, so I'm only going to go to the Nyingma, yeah, right? But he had these multiple transmissions, and he taught them, yeah. So I think he thought of himself as a Chaksok teacher, right? And then this is also a good question though, because some songs use more of what we would say is more like Dzogchen terminology in the way that the nature of mind is described, or the preliminary practices of cutting through meditation, right? Or the way that the path is described, where you have, he'll describe the 9 jhanas, for example, which is like a very much Nyingma kind of typology, and talk about Tugel and Treksha and the lamps and the visions, right? Stuff like that, yeah. So he's like bearing, I guess, his Dzogchen Bahat when he's saying that song, depending on where he was and who he's talking to. But then in other songs, it's much more, you get those what we would call a Mahamudra style or Chakchen style terminology in that song. So I do think it's probably productive, I would say, to read through it that way and say, oh, there's these meditation instructions. Actually, we can, because it's kind of traceable a little bit to an extent, right? And there's enough textual literature to unpack some of these questions, not all of them. For example, he talks about his first Mahamudra training from being from Gyalwang Singye. He tells us who it's from. Gyalwang Singye has a biography, or he wrote a biography of his father. I don't know if but he wrote a biography of his father, who was his main teacher. And we can read, I haven't read it, but we can read that biography and then look for phraseology that, Orgyan Tenzin's picking up again. For example, so Thupten Wangbo, who was his Karma Kagyu master that he met when he was quite young in Dolpo. We know enough about him. We know where he trained, and we also have a fragment, not the full thing. Maybe it's findable. I haven't done a lot of work to try to find it, but we have a fragment of his biography, right? It's like maybe 12 or 15 pages or something. And so one of Orgyan Tenzin's songs is super duper close to some of the stuff in that text about the discussion about bodhicitta, right? And it's so close that either Orgyan Tenzin is hearing the words that he was taught from his own teacher, who wrote about it in his own biography the way it was taught, and he's like remembering it and rewriting it, or he actually had the text and he's like kind of copying stuff out, which I would think is actually less likely, but still within the realm of possibility, right? And so you could say, oh, this is the bodhicitta teachings he got from Thupten Wangbo, right? Or you could say, this is so similar to the way Gyalwang Singye describes, like, Mudra meditation and his father that he got from, or we have Organ Pelzongs and we have Kunzon Longyang, we have the different biographies. And so that's like kind of, you could say, oh, this must be more influence. This sounds like it's more influence from them or that. But more historically, the question of how did Choksok get wound up together like that is a big one. Somebody should write a good book about that, if they haven't already.
And also, have you gotten a chance to speak with Dolpo Tadru Rinpoche, who's here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And okay, great. Dolpo guy. Yeah, good.
Okay, thanks everyone. That's all the time we have. So thank you very much, Mike.